6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast, and today we welcome back author and historian Simon Elliott, and today we're discussing his brand new book, a book that's been in the making for a very long time, The African Emperor, The Life of Septimius Severus. How you doing, Simon?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me back on, mate.
No, it's all right. No, we've been talking about Severus for a very long time now, so I think it's about time we do a full episode on him.
You know what? I just thinking as we were chatting before we started recording, his story is very much a story of our time, is it not? Because we're talking about the most authoritarian Roman emperor, in my opinion. A Roman emperor who led more legions than any other emperor. An emperor who spent his life, once emperor, on campaign, hating the political classes in Rome, building his monumental arch, the Arch of Septimius Severus, to celebrate his victory over Parthia, on the foundations of the Senate House, to remind the senators who the boss was, and a man who literally was the most militarized authoritarian Roman emperor. And it's very topical for the age in which we live, isn't it?
Oh, totally is, and particularly with the backdrop of how he came to power as well. I think, but we are skipping ahead quite a lot now.
I think.
Yeah. What made you want to write about and learn about Severus? Because you've written so many books now, but this has always seemed in our conversations to be the central book you wanted to write.
I think my entry point to writing about the Roman world was about the Classis Britannica, the Roman fleet, and that featured in my PhD thesis, Ragstone to Riches, which is about how Roman London was built. That includes the land wall, which he built, by the way, Severus. And I was doing the PhD thesis and I was writing the Seagulls book at the same time, and I ended up focusing on a campaign at the beginning of the 3rd century where the fleet took part, the last big one it took part in actually in Britain, before it disappeared, which was Severus's campaigns in the far north. And that really sort of was my entry point. And then suddenly you start unpicking this story and you suddenly Severus led in Britain 50,000 men, which is the largest campaigning force ever to fight on British soil. And so just through the prism of looking at the Classis Britannica, I suddenly alighted on this story of this amazing emperor. And the really interesting thing is actually very few people have focused on him. So most people focus on the likes of Trajan or Hadrian or Constantine or Diocletian, but not Septimius Severus. So as a historian also, it sort of gave me a completely clear field. So it was like a win-win for this particular happy archaeologist.
I can always see you're very happy when you talk about Severus, and having a clear run at a topic is always far more fun as a historian. But then the title of your book, The African Emperor, does kind of point to some people having a certain idea of what Severus was like and look like as a person. So could you just tell us about Severus as a person?
So very much the first chapter in the book, as you know, is identity and race in the Roman world. And when you're having a conversation about Severus, because he was very dark-skinned and he was from North Africa, you can end up going down a rabbit hole with some people wanting to know, was he the Black Emperor? What do you mean by black, etc. So actually what I did at the beginning of the book is the facts are these. He was North African. He was from Leptis Magna, which is in modern Libya. He came from a very, very super rich family in a very, very super rich part of the Roman world. Remember, Roman North Africa is an integral part of the empire, much more so than northwestern Europe, where we are recording today, because it was a Mediterranean empire. So the people who would have stood out in terms of skin colour in the Roman world, in Rome, are you and I. Big, tall Vikings. Which is a very good analogy, actually, for both of us as rugby players. But we'd be the ones who stood out in Roman Rome, not Septimius Severus with his dark skin. His father was Punic. His father's family were Punic, so they're originally from Phoenicia, became Carthaginian colonizers, and so Severus's family probably had more in common with Hannibal on his father's side than it did with Augustus. And his mother was Italian, but it's the fact he had the dark skin. Some people call him I call him the African Emperor because he was African. Some people call him the Black Emperor because he had dark skin. So I tackle it head on in the book. In the first chapter, I set out the facts and people can make up their own minds. But for me, the key narrative I've taken out of researching that chapter was that the Romans were racist, but not in the way we are. They weren't racist. There's very little evidence they're racist in terms of skin colour, because it was a very multicultural society, obviously, and it was Mediterranean, North Africa, Europe, etc. But the Romans were racist in the sense that, and it's probably more xenophobia than racist, the Romans looked at you and your origins, and then they thought of you either as a Roman or not a Roman. So you were either Roman or a barbarian. And if you were the latter, you were completely other. You had no status, etc. You were from outside the empire. You could be treated as the Romans wanted to do. So they were racist or xenophobic in that sense, but not in skin colour sense, the way that we talk about it today.
I think that really strikes at a misconception that we have about the Roman Empire. And we talk about this most times we discuss it, is that it is a Mediterranean empire and all that land around there is contributing to Rome. But then we've spoken about it in the past as well. There's so many different versions of this empire. There's the Principate, the Dominate, the Republic. What is Rome like at the time that Severus is growing up? Is it at a peak? Is it stable? Is it growing? What is it like?
So he's born in Leptis Magna in 145, probably goes to Rome for the first time for his education in his early to mid-teens. So you're looking at Rome in the 160s, 170s as he begins his progress along the Cursus Honorum. And it's at the height of Roman power, really, because you're in the middle of the Roman Principate phase of empire. So if you look at the various phases of the Roman Empire, certainly in the West, you have the Roman Republic, 509 BC through to 27 BC, when Augustus becomes the first emperor. The Principate phase of empire, 27 BC through to the end of the crisis of the 3rd century in 284, when Diocletian becomes the emperor, and then Diocletian reboots the whole empire into the Dominate. So we are in the middle of the Principate when the Roman Empire is at the height of its power, and he's growing up in a time of relative stability in the Roman world as well. It's in the reign of Antoninus Pius, very long, peaceable reign, into the reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, the Diarch emperors, who do start their reign in conflict with the Parthians, and later Marcus Aurelius fights the Marcomannic Wars, which we see in the movie Gladiator. But when Severus is growing up, the Roman Empire, the Principate phase, is at the height of its power. So it's stable, and it gives him a platform to begin a steady progress along the Cursus Honorum.
So how does he start coming up through the ranks as a politician? Because we've spoken about as well that there's an interlinking between the military and politics within Rome.
There is. So the Cursus Honorum is the career path of a Roman senatorial man. The posts can alternate between military and civilian. So you could, on the one hand, be leading a legion, and on the other hand, you could be being a senior magistrate in Rome. You could be in charge of aqueducts in Rome, or you could be a governor of a province, or various things like that. So it's all intermixed and interlinked. Now, Severus is very interesting because Severus initially, bearing in mind he's the most militaristic of all the Roman emperors, in my opinion, he's very canny because he doesn't choose any military roles to start with, and he can choose the roles he goes into in the Cursus Honorum, but he doesn't choose any military ones. They're all civilian ones. And I guess the first big military posting he gets is when he's posted to the eastern frontier into Syria, where he becomes the legate in charge of Legio for Scythica. Now, the interesting thing there is, in terms of military postings, he skipped all the junior officer roles and has gone straight to being the legate, the general in charge of the legion.
And how does that kind of impact the way that others see him? Because if he's taking civilian roles and then instantly going to a very high-powered military role, surely that's affecting his relationships with others around him and other people going up through the ranks.
You know what, actually, it's a very good point. I don't think he cares, actually. He's clearly a very, very single-minded individual. I think, he's one of those individuals that had a sense of personal destiny from a young age, actually. And I think he's very careful in the way that he positions himself as he rises through the ranks. So he's ticking all the right boxes, talking to all the right people, but I think he's making mental notes all the time, because obviously later when he becomes the emperor, he almost rebuilds the Roman Empire along North African lines. So I think it's all very carefully planned in his head.
So if he's not thinking about what other people around him and he's planning everything, he still has to have a relationship with those top leaders like Marcus Aurelius. So how is he, is he reaching up to the emperor and Aurelius to build that relationship and get more power and get more standing, or is he just standing and learning from Marcus Aurelius?
Great question. Bit of both, I think, actually. So let's go back to the fact he's in his head. He's planning it all. He's got a sense of ambition. He knows where he wants to end up. So through the natural system of Roman governance, he's seeking patronage anyway, but he's doing it in a very clever way, and he's always in position to benefit in a way that his contemporaries aren't. So, for example, when later he's fighting his civil wars, the people who he's fighting the civil wars against were like Pescennius Niger and Clodius Albinus. They were part of his band of brothers, which he sort of like created around him while he was fighting the Marcomannic Wars. So I think actually it's a bit of both, to be honest.
So you mentioned that band of brothers before the civil wars, and I think it's best that we go through his band of brothers and his military kind of career first before we get to that. So how has he built this career up as a military leader? How has he been able to solidify those skills when he's not taken some of these junior officer rankings?
Great question, actually. I think again, I go back to my point that it's all planned, and I think he's studying how to do things well in advance of doing them. So when he's with Legio IV Scythica in Syria, he's based at Zuegma, so he's based basically on a border crossing today between Turkey and Syria. That's where he's based. The legion he's got is holding the frontier there, along with two other legions which are further south and one which is further north. But they're all interlinked, and you wouldn't get that post, because it's very important, holding the Syrian frontier against the Parthians at the time. You wouldn't get that post unless you were trusted, and it's not the kind of posting which you would see in a Ridley Scott movie where the son of a famous senator would get promoted without knowing how to do the job. So he's clearly studied how to do it, and he's trusted to do it as well. But there's another point there as well, going back to our point about patronage. The governor of Syria at the time is Pertinax. Now, Pertinax is the first emperor in the year of the five emperors we'll come to later. But Pertinax, about a decade older than Severus, is the son of a manumitted slave who was very famous in the Roman world because he's the everyman. He made his name on his own terms from a very low beginning. So in the Roman world, it's this famous Caesar or Augustus, really, because it's there. It's a conceit, clearly, but it's there to prove that anybody can be successful if you're a Roman citizen. And Pertinax, the governor of Syria, becomes Severus's mentor from that point. So as Severus then continues his progression along the Cursus Honorum, Pertinax is always there in the background to help him along.
That you mentioned that mentor relationship. It's shown through time and time again within the Roman Empire how important it is, and how important it is to have people around you to guide you and to be a sounding board. And part of it for Severus that I saw was his personal relationships in his personal life away from his career, and him being married, but not once but twice. So how does that play into Severus's development as a person, but also how he grows as well? Because his first wife passed away.
Well, again, the Severan story arc, especially in terms of his personal relationships, almost gets to Game of Thrones levels of fiction. His next big posting after Syria is to become the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, which is the big, fabulously rich province in the centre of Gaul. It's a big strip through the middle running from the Channel Islands to the Alps. The capital is Lyon, Roman Lugdunum. And while he's there, his first wife, Pacimaziana, dies, and almost immediately a letter is sent, we are told by the historians. A letter is sent back to Syria, to the capital Antioch, requesting the hand in marriage of the love of his life, Julia Domna. Julia Domna is super rich. So Severus comes from a rich family in a rich part of the empire, but Julia Domna is the daughter of the chief priest of the sun god Heliogabalus so that family originally was the ruling family of Emesa, and then when it became part of the Roman world, they became the chief priests. That's super rich, right? And Severus clearly met her while he was in Syria commanding his legion. So you've got this strapping legate, his bronze muscled cuirass, great plumed helmet, etc. Famously dark skin, trimmed beard, a natty little sort of a fork at the end of his beard he's famous for. They clearly got on, because everything I read about them in contemporary literature shows that they were absolutely, once they married in Lugdunum, because she hot-footed it across the Mediterranean to go and join him as soon as the letter came. They got married. Within a year, Caracalla was born the eldest son, and then on the way back to Rome in Milan a year later, Gita is born. And they were devoted to each other. I call them, as you know in the book, I call them the power couple of their known Roman world, because they were. She was a very powerful figure in her own right within the Roman world. One, because she was the empress once she became the emperor, but two, because she was so rich, she effectively allowed him to do whatever he wanted on her own terms, obviously, but because she was so rich.
And I found that dynamic between the two really, really fascinating. But then, as you mentioned, you have the birth of Caracalla and Gita, who we know about through Ridley Scott's Gladiator 2 movie, which I know you love. But then you're mentioning Severus becoming emperor, and this whole period is incredibly messy. What is happening in AD 193, and what's the situation for Severus?
So it's all about Commodus, right? The mad, bad Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, who, bear in mind, when he became the emperor in 180, Marcus Aurelius' father, in his will, appointed 40 senior aristocrats to be his advisors, because basically he knew he was a wrong 'un. And by the way, one of them was Pertinax. And at the end of 192, only one of them was still alive, Pertinax, who's the prefect of Rome. But the rest had all been fed to lions in the arena, assassinated out of hand. So Commodus gets a bad press, and he deserves everything. Joaquin Phoenix portrays him amazingly well in the original Gladiator movie. Absolutely nails it, as far as I'm concerned. He was mad and bad news for Rome, especially the Roman leading classes. So 192 to 193, New Year's Eve, the Praetorian prefect and the court chamberlain and Marcia, who is the mistress of Commodus, hatch a plot, because they find they're on a proscription list and they're there for the chop beginning of the new year. So they try and assassinate Commodus around midnight on New Year's Eve, and Marcia feeds him poisoned sweetmeats. So the poisoned sweetmeats are fed, but it's New Year's Eve, so Commodus has been on the lash all day, and decides to have a bath to sweat everything off, and he sweats the poison out as well. But he's suspicious that something's happened, and he accuses Marcia. But fortunately, it's a very clever plan. They've got a plan B. The plan B being they've got a Commodus's wrestling trainer called Narcissus hiding behind a curtain, who comes out and strangles him to death. Stranger than fiction. So they need a new emperor. It's into the early hours of 193. The court chamberlain and the Praetorian prefect go and find Pertinax in his house, who's at that moment, as I mentioned, he's the prefect of Rome. And Pertinax thinks he's going to get assassinated, right? And he says, for God's sake, just get on with it. I can't believe I'm the only one left after all those got whacked by Commodus. Just get on with it. I don't want the stress anymore. And said, no. We want you to be the emperor. So he becomes the emperor, and you get this great scene where everyone's so surprised by everything that in the middle of the night he walks down to the Forum Romanum from his house, and he calls a sitting of the Senate to announce himself as the new emperor, but they can't find the keys because whoever's got the keys is also out on the lash because it's New Year's Eve. So while they're looking for the keys, or the bailiff with the keys, Pertinax has to sit on his own next door on the steps of the Temple of Concord for 3 hours in the middle of the night, waiting for the keys to come to open the Senate so he can be officially declared the emperor. So again, stranger than fiction. But he becomes the emperor, and he turns out to be a very, very, very worthy emperor. He wants to be a new Marcus Aurelius. But you get this narrative that at the end of the first month, the Praetorian Guard go to him and say, give us some money. And he says, no, because the fiscus treasury is broke. At the end of month 2, end of February, they go to him and say, give us some money or we'll kill you. And he says, still no money. So at the end of the 3rd month, March, they kill him. So he's assassinated in the palace on the Palatine Hill. And then you get Didius Julianus bribing himself to briefly become the emperor. But word gets out of Pertinax being assassinated at the end of March, and it goes north to the Danube frontier, where Severus is at that moment based, commanding the Roman legions on the Danube. The word goes to Britain, where Clodius Albinus is the governor, and word goes to Antioch, where Pescennius Niger is the governor. And there's a race for power. And of course, Severus is only on the Danube, so he just descends on Rome, enters the, and he's obviously about a week earlier than the other two, because they're at the far ends of the empire. Descends on Rome, goes straight to the Senate House, swords drawn, and says, "I'm the emperor." He's got all his legions with him. "I'm the emperor," and they'll say, "Absolutely, you are not a problem." And that's it. That's how he becomes the emperor, at the point of a sword. And from that point, you've got this very militaristic emperor, only being militaristic on his Cursus Honorum towards the end of his pre-imperial career, and then suddenly he's the emperor. And from that moment on, he's on campaign nearly all the time.
And you can't not be a militaristic emperor if you come to it in that way. But then you mentioned Albinus and Niger. How does Severus deal with these two? Because said they've come from a far reach of the empire. They're a week later, but they still have that intention to come and be emperor.
He's very canny. So he knows he's going to have to fight them eventually. He knows he's got the drop on them. So he's now in Rome, and he's now been declared the emperor at the point of a sword. But he's been declared the emperor. He's also all three of them were mates, remember, in the Marcomannic Wars. And they're all very, very good generals. Pertinax was also, by the way, part of the band of brothers as well. It's a great story in its own right about these imperial candidates in the year of the five emperors in 193, all fighting together as mates. But now they're not. So he's got the drop on them. And he decides he's going to be very clever. And he buys off Albinus in Britain by making him his junior emperor, his Caesar. And he then targets Niger in Syria. And you have the first Eastern campaign where Severus is victorious. Niger is captured and beheaded while he's trying to flee after losing a battle to the Parthians. Severus then starts campaigning in the east. But at the beginning of 197, he gets word from Gaul that Albinus has actually reneged on the deal. He's actually seen through it, and he's marched into Gaul with the three British legions, all three legions coming. And from that point onwards, you get this really big titanic clash building up to the Battle of Lugdunum in 197, when Severus has to hot-foot it back from the east. He travels along the Rhine, the Danube and the Rhine, collecting troops as he goes, then plunges through the centre of Gaul and meets Albinus in battle at the Battle of Lugdunum, which Cassius Dio tells us involved 300,000 men, the largest civil war battle in Roman history. Now, clearly that's a huge exaggeration, because the entire Roman military establishment's about 300,000 men. But it looks as though each side may have had 75,000 men. That's a big deal, and it's a very, very narrow win for Severus. He only just wins after 2 days. He loses his horse twice. Later in life, he's described as having a condition which we interpret today as being gout, but I think actually it might have been a badly healed injury from that battle when he fell off his horse twice. But from that point onwards, Severus has defeated Niger. He's dead. He's got Albinus, chops his head off. He's dead, so that's it. There's no other candidates in play. So he becomes emperor in 193. In 197, there's no that. He's the unchallenged emperor.
So how does he set about moulding and almost fixing this Roman Empire that's just gone through chaotic civil war, a nutcase emperor beforehand as well? How does he go about fixing it and building up this Severan dynasty?
So I call it the Severan reset, because basically from that point onwards, he's slipping North Africans, family members very often, into positions of power as legates or as governors or as procurators in various provinces. And that's a trend that goes all the way through his time as emperor, such that I make the case in the book, as you know, that it could almost be like a sort of a commercial hard takeover. It's not a good time to be an Italian in power. It's a great time to be a North African. And certainly it works for Severus, because even after his death into the reign of Caracalla, his eldest son, which was a troubled reign, as you know, even then the empire still was very stable. And it was very stable because Severus basically reset it in his own image.
And you also mention, within the book, that Severus attempts to tie himself to more successful previous previously successful emperors like Marcus Aurelius and Pertinax, how does their kind of image and legacy help out Severus?
So it's a very important thing for the Romans in going into the 3rd century to find a way of associating yourself with the Antonine dynasty. So, for example, Caracalla's actual name was Antoninus. That was his second name, was his second full family name, because when Severus was rising through his Cursus Honorum, he renamed Caracalla. Caracalla is a Gallic cloak, by the way, it's a nickname. He renamed him Antoninus so he could associate himself with the Antonine dynasty. So it's all about associating yourself with this fine, upstanding dynasty with Antoninus Pius, this huge period of history in the Roman world. And then Marcus Aurelius as well, the great philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So associating yourself with those is really important, because what that also does is that helps buy your way into the political classes of Rome as well.
So those political classes who have seen Severus rise up to be an emperor, how are they now viewing him?
Terrified.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrified. They're absolutely terrified, mate. And they're terrified because, if you bear in mind, Severus just fought from 193 to 197, 4 years of civil wars. And each time a candidate is defeated, they have supporters in the Senate, and those supporters in the Senate get whacked, right? And often the Severan way of doing it is brutal. You know, no trial, executed, fed to lions in the arena, all sorts of nastiness. And there's about if the Senate's got, say, 600 senators, 100 of them get assassinated in some way, shape or form after Niger is defeated in the east, and another 100 suffer the same fate after Albinus is defeated as well. So that's 200, that's a third of the Senate executed out of hand, right? And remember, Severus is literally an emperor at the point of a sword. And also, they know that Severus can't stand them either. I mean, Severus tries to avoid Rome like the plague most of the time. He's only there 4 times as emperor, and each time is only for a matter of months, because he just wants to be out on campaign with his troops. Remember, on his deathbed, he tells Caracalla and Geta, trust the military, look after each other, and ignore everybody else. And that's him, you know. And also, interestingly, Jackson, if you look at him as an authoritarian example for the modern world, look what he does with the imperial fiscus treasury. Because before Severus, an emperor who's executing rivals puts the money that they accrue from them, you know, selling their estates, grabbing their wealth, selling their slaves, that goes into the fiscus treasury. But Severus doesn't do that. Severus puts about half into the fiscus treasury. And this is a third of the Senate, right? Half into the fiscus treasury and half into his own back pocket. So he doesn't care what anybody thinks about him at all. He's a very militaristic... I'm often asked why I like him, by the way, and actually I struggle to say why I like him, because he is such a militaristic emperor, and he's aggrandizing his own family all the time. And of course, as you know, the Severan dynasty peaks with him and goes downhill afterwards, because all the subsequent, he's the only one who dies in his own bed.
That's much how it is with a lot of autocratic leaders across the centuries. But then I can't help but think when you say that, did he actually want to be emperor, or was he kind of forced into a position because of the situation?
Again, it's a really fantastic question. Right, I always give you a straight answer. So I think from a young age, I think he'd always planned to get the top job, okay? Always backed himself, very careful about how he advanced his career, which we've already discussed, and I think that all points to the fact that he always wanted to be the emperor, and he was just presented with this unique opportunity because of where he was based. If you bear in mind where he was on the Danube at 193 at New Year, Carnuntum is near Vienna, so it's on the upper Danube, and it's holding the Danubian frontier from Barbaricum in the north, and it's the scene where you've just had the Marcomannic Wars, the last 30 years. All the legions there are veteran legions, so Severus couldn't be better placed. He's the nearest candidate. He's got 5 veteran legions with him. By the way, the one that declares him the emperor, Legio 14 Gemina, is the legion which defeated Boudica. So he couldn't have the cards better stacked for himself. Again, I just think he was lucky where he was there, but I think he'd always intended to become the emperor, actually. And remember the chaos that you have in the reign of Commodus, you know, ends absolutely chaotically, and he's a tough guy. And he's exactly probably what the Romans wanted, apart from the senators.
Because he does seem like this perfect candidate for Rome at the time. And, his military leadership is just perfectly fitting in with the situation that had been taken over for the last 40 years. But then Britain, and you've done a lot of work on Roman Britain, and we always end up, regardless of what the episode is about, talking about Severan Britain. So why does Severus come to Britain? And, does he want to be there? But then how does it become a defining part of his legacy?
So let's look at very briefly. Let's do a recap on his campaign. So he's defeated he's defeated Albinus. So he goes back from Gaul and then launches his second Eastern campaign. And this is so successful. It's one of the most successful Roman military campaigns. He defeats the Parthians and he captures and sacks their capital city, Ctesiphon. Very big deal for the Romans. This is going to lead straight into Britain. He then goes on a sort of a grand tour of his own sort of North Africa, and it gets rebuilt in his image everywhere he goes, and campaigns against the Garamantes, who are a Berber tribe, deep into the Sahara, right? And everywhere he's going, he's extending the borders. Now, this is a very militaristic emperor who's clearly ambitious, and he's getting into his 60s, and he's thinking of legacy, right? He's thinking of his legacy. If you're to look at the Roman emperor who other Romans thought of as the best, it wasn't Caesar, because he was never the emperor. It was Augustus, the first emperor, right? That's why in the Roman world, the senior emperor is an Augustus and the junior one is a Caesar, right? So it's Augustus. But Augustus didn't do two things. The poet Horace wrote at the turn of the 1st century BC AD that Augustus will only be a god if he conquers the pesky Brits and the pesky Persians, the Parthians. And he didn't do either. It's very clever, Augustus, actually. He could have invaded, he planned to invade Britain 3 times, but always found an excuse not to do it. But Severus has done one of them, one of the very few Roman emperors to defeat the Parthians and sack their capital, on the Tigris Valley. So this is Severus, and he's looking towards the end of his life. If I can conquer the far north of Britain, which the Romans never did, if I can conquer the far north of Britain, I'll be the greatest Roman leader of all time, right? Because he'll conquer the pesky Brits and the pesky Parthians, which no other Roman emperor has done. And so that's what he does. And you get this letter arriving in Rome in 207 from the British governor Senecio, which I think is a conceit, by the way. I think it's a setup by Severus to give him an excuse. The letter says that there's trouble in the north and the entire province, not the north, the entire province is in danger of being overrun, and I need your help or reinforcements. And of course, you get the Severan surge. I had Severan in front of lots of words because it's all highly accurate. The Severan surge, and it leads 50,000 men here, right? 50,000 men in the last Roman attempt to conquer the far north. And you have these 2 genocidal campaigns in 209 and then 210, at the end of which Severus and Caracalla, his elder son, who is fighting with him, leading the legions, declare themselves Britannicus, and they have coins minted, and it's all one. And then, as you know, Severus dies in the freezing cold of a northern British winter in February 211 in York. But here's the thing. At the point he died, he thought he'd done it. He thought he'd become the greatest ever Roman emperor at the point he died. And it's only after his death, when Caracalla and Geta in York hate each other, race back to Rome to try and secure power for themselves, it's only after that that the Romans drop back down from the north again, because the Severan political imperative to hold the north, far north of Britain, isn't there anymore. So at the point he died, though, he thought he'd done it. He thought he'd beaten Augustus.
So, is he the most successful Roman emperor based off that life and doing that?
If let's use a Star Trek analogy, right? So if you were to look at the Roman Empire as being a mix of the Klingons and the Borg, so 2 very, very militaristic groups of protagonists in Star Trek, you can almost get your head into certainly a Roman military leader's headspace. And for and this is the Roman Empire. It's an empire for a start. And empires only work if they're growing, don't they? Because they start collapsing when they stop growing. It's an empire, and therefore it's going to be militaristic. Now, based on those analogies, I think the Romans would have thought he was the most successful emperor, yeah. Ticks all the boxes. I mean, look. He led 33 legions, more than any Roman emperor before or after. Very rarely lost. Monumentalized his rule and his reign everywhere he went. So, for example, your listeners might not realise that the land walls of Roman London, which became the medieval walls, which define the square mile, the city of London to this day, were built by Severus in the wake of his defeat of Albinus in 197 as a statement to the people of London, the ruling classes in Britain, Roman Britain. I can build a 3.2 kilometre land wall just like that. So if you misbehave again, you know what's coming, and guess what? They didn't misbehave again. So I think from a Roman perspective, he ticks every single box.
So why do you think we've forgotten him today? Why do you think he's kind of lost within the discourse around Caesar, Augustus, Octavius, and so on?
You know what? So, God, you're asking some really good questions today, mate. As always, by the way. I think his narrative gets lost in the decline of the Roman Empire at the end of the Principate phase of empire. So Severus is the emperor from 193, sole emperor from 197, dies in York in 211. Caracalla and Geta are diarch emperors. Severus wants them to rule together, but they hate each other, and Caracalla has Geta killed by the end of the year, who Geta then dies bleeding to death in his mum's arms, Julia Domina. You then have Caracalla, who's then assassinated himself in 217 while spending a penny against a tree, travelling to see a temple on the eastern frontier. You then get, very briefly, Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, who's not a blood relative, but is part of the Severan dynasty, very briefly, but he's assassinated. You then get Elagabalus, who's assassinated with his mum, and then you get Severus Alexander, who's assassinated with his mum. So in actual fact, with all that drama, I think the success point of the dynasty, the Severan years, gets overshadowed by what happened afterwards. And then, of course, you spiral from the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 straight into the catastrophic crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire almost implodes, and it's only the great Diocletian that drags it out in 284 when he becomes the emperor. The end of the Principate is so full of astonishing, tall stories which happen to be real that I think the glory years of Severus as a military leader certainly just gets lost in it.
I can certainly see how that gets lost in all this drama and death, and I think that's the right time now to ask you a final fun question, Simon. I'm going to change it up slightly. I'm going to ask you, who would you have play Severus in a movie?
Oh my word! What a fantastic question. Well, you know what? I was convinced Denzel Washington was going to play him in Gladiator 2. Denzel Washington plays Macrinus, so I think Denzel Washington would have been a great actor to play him. I tell you what, Pedro Pascal.
I think that's a great shout. I think that's fantastic.
Pedro Pascal. So Septimius Severus is the Mandalorian.
I like that a lot.
And the fall of the Severan dynasty as an analogy for The Last of Us, or vice versa.
I think that's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much, mate. Now, obviously, we've only spoken about a tiny proportion of Severus's life. So where can people get a copy of your new book, The African Emperor?
It's going to be out very shortly, in fact, actually next week, in all good bookshops and on all good book buying websites. And it's going to, as you can gather, just because we're talking today, it's going to get a lot of promotion because it's a very big story. And the first chapter, Race and Identity in the Roman World, I think is a really important narrative for the world in which we live today, actually. So it speaks to our age. The story of Severus speaks to our age. We live in an age when there's far too much military activity taking place around the world. We live in an age when people, when given the chance to be kind to each other, often aren't. So therefore, reading the story of the African Emperor can really shed some light on the world we live in today, I think.
I think, actually, no, I know I've seen all of that in the book, so I do think it is a very good parallel for today's world. And then obviously, people want to go and interact with you and your work. Where can they find you online?
Just find, I think I should still be the first Simon Elliott you'll find on Google. And the first thing you'll get is my website, and on my website is my email address. And if you want to get in touch with me, I'm very happy to talk to people. Just reach out to me on my website.
Brilliant. Well, I'll make sure to link for all of those in the description below. But thank you very much for coming on, Simon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me, mate.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast.